All right, there we go. So we're recording. Sure there's no one hanging out in the. Okay, there we go. Sorry, so I've worked in a couple of different contexts, from academic settings to the community, and both of which have taught me a lot about disability and physical activity. So way back in the beginning, I have an undergraduate degree in physical education and kinesiology from Laurier. So I grew up in Ontario, and that's where I've done most of my schooling. And yeah, that was kind of where things started. Then I moved to Alberta and I did my postgraduate studies at the University of Alberta. At that time, it was the Faculty of Physical Education and Recreation, and I focused on adapted physical activity. So looking at physical activity experiences for folks from the disability community. Throughout that journey, I moved back to Ontario, and during that time, I had a chance to take on a full-time role with Ability Centre. So some of you may be familiar with the organization. They're located just outside of Toronto, and they're a fully inclusive sport and recreation center. I started with them in 2012 when the center first opened, and it was a really interesting opportunity to see an organization commit to inclusive recreation services from the beginning, to see how that influenced policies and programming and staff training and, participant recruitment and registration, all of those bits and pieces. And throughout that time, it was a really incredible experience. And they really have invested in education and research and seeing how that really connects to the community experience. So yeah, they're a pretty unique organization, and they've really made an impact across the country. So definitely continue to work with them anytime I have an opportunity to do so. Then I did some sessional teaching with a couple of schools in Ontario, specifically on health and disability studies and summer camp experiences, lots of different things around that theme of disability and physical activity. Then I had a chance to go to Ireland to do a postdoc because I finally finished my PhD, and I worked with the UNESCO chair in inclusive physical education, sport, recreation, and fitness. And that was a really unique experience to learn more about how to develop resources for those working in the field of exercise and fitness and strength and conditioning, and what kind of supports and resources they needed when it came to supporting folks from the disability community. So in my time there, I worked on some resource development specifically around exercise and exercise and fitness for those working in the fitness industry. So that was pretty neat. And it was really interesting to be in a different country and to be over in Europe and to understand how they connect with some of the global policies in a different way that maybe I haven't done in some of the organizations that I've worked with here in Canada. Then that project kind of came to an end, and then I returned to Canada. And it was at that time that I took the position here at the Stedward Center and had a chance to come out here. And, returning to Edmonton has been really wonderful. Alberta's a great province and place to raise a family. And so now I'm sort of here working in this field of adapted physical activity, and I really, really love the direction that a lot of stuff is going. So I'm thrilled to be here today to talk with you a little bit about some of these ideas. So I mentioned the Stedward Center. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar. I see a lot of familiar names on here, so I know many of you know the Stedward Center, who we are and what we do. To tell you a little bit more, our vision is focused on facilitating adapted physical activity and parasport opportunities for everyone. So we really highlight that kind of pathway to participation. We're a teaching and research center. We're housed within the Faculty of Kinesiology, Sport, and Recreation at the U of A. And so throughout a year, we sort of, we should look at our new numbers, but pre-COVID, we were servicing nearly 1,000 adults, youth, and children experiencing disability. And then we provide volunteer opportunities to approximately 250 volunteers. I often like to highlight our core values because I think this really speaks to what is important to us at the Stedward Center. And this means a lot in terms of how we go about making decisions. I think it speaks a little bit too about where I'm coming from and why this, these ideas of looking at ableism within our practices, why that matters to us. So within our core values, we have embodied ways of knowing, which means that we believe that living with impairment is best understood by those living with impairment. We really believe that they are the experts and are constantly trying to find ways to connect with those, whether that means, bringing folks on to our team as volunteers, staff, finding ways to engage with our members as much as possible. Connection means that we are only as strong as our relationships within our team, partners, and members. Collaboration means that we believe more can be accomplished in partnership than alone. That's collaboration. Leadership means that we believe that sharing our insights and perspective can provoke new ways of thinking, spark discussion, and inspire action. So that's one of the reasons why I love presenting to a group like all of you, because it's a chance to really start to hopefully have some discussion and to think about what these ideas mean for all of you in your own practice. That kind of leads to this idea of learning, meaning that it's about asking questions and learning from others to really try to constantly improve and grow. And then finally, accessible. So we believe that adapted physical activity and parasport development should be available to all who choose to participate. And that can mean many different things. It can mean physical accessibility to spaces, but it can also mean financial accessibility in terms of making registration fees as low as possible, or offering subsidies or scholarships, or maybe it's about attitudes or awareness or staff training, all of these different things. So that's another really important core value that really guides our practice. Okay, so to get us started, I wanted to include a couple of images here that really speak to this idea of what should an active person look like. And so in preparing for presentations, I wanted to see what kind of images came up. There's a couple of stock image sites that I've used many times. I can't remember which one these came from, but I use the search terms exercise and fitness. And this is a sample of some of the images that came up. So to kind of describe these a little bit so that we're all on the same page, there's a photo of a male presenting person doing a chin-up. They have muscular arms and do not appear to have an impairment. In the middle image, there's an image of a group yoga class in which all of the bodies are slender. They're all performing the yoga pose in the same way. There's not a lot of variation in terms of what those bodies are doing. And then on the far right side, the last image is of a female presenting person who is running up a set of stadium stairs. They also appear to have a thin body and do not appear to have an impairment. So in putting in kind of our ideas about fitness and exercise, these are the images that are coming up. So my question then is, what about this? So based on the criteria from the last slide, these images would not be considered to be active people. There are bodies in these images here that I have shown that are different sizes and shapes. There are people whose bodies move differently. So for example, on the far left, there's an image of a male using a power wheelchair who moves differently from the instructor beside him. They're both achieving the same goal of stretching the side of their body, but their bodies do move differently. In the center, there's an image of two sprinters, both of whom have arm amputations. They may look familiar to you, knowing that for many of you who are involved in high performance sport, knowing that these are competitive athletes. And then on the far right, we have an image of a person with Down syndrome performing a yoga pose whose body may not be described as thin. So to find these images, I had to use search terms other than fitness and exercise. So I specifically had to include disability and impairment, as they would not typically show up because they would not meet our ideal standards for human movement. And so that really serves the basis for what we're talking about here today. So I'd like to start off by offering a really brief introduction to ableism. And then we're going to talk about some examples so that we can really see, what does that actually mean? What does that look like for all of us working in sport, physical activity, and recreation? So I'm curious if ableism is a term that you've heard before. So if it's something that you've heard before, that you're somewhat familiar with, just use the emojis, give me a thumbs up, or anyone that you feel like doing. I'm happy to see a party sign, hand clap, anything. Okay, so I see it's a term that is somewhat familiar for some of you. So within this idea, it's basically suggesting that we have these beliefs and practices that suggest that disability is a diminished state of being human. So anyone who does not meet these normative standards of being, so in those bodies that I just shared earlier, those thin bodies that all move in the same way, Anyone who does not meet those standards is therefore considered less than human. So that's really inherent within this idea of ableism. It's that notion that there is a normative way of being, and that anyone who doesn't meet that doesn't really count. Sorry, just trying to get my screen to move to the next one. So why ableism? Why are we taking a look at this idea? What does that actually mean? Why does that matter? Well, it's important that we look at this idea of why disability. So disability is being left out of many of the conversations about intersecting identities. Even though we have this understanding that, we know that many Canadians identify as experiencing disability. So according to a 2017 Canadian Survey on Disability, more than 6 million Canadians aged 15 and over, so that's about 22% of the population, identify as having a disability. So to help us continue to talk a little bit about disability, I wanted to offer a really quick introduction to a couple of models of disability. If this is something that you've done reading on or talked about, you'll know that there's many, many different ways of conceptualizing disability. But I think for the purpose of our discussion today, I thought I would just offer kind of our first, the starting points by looking at the medical and the social model. So for the medical model of disability, it really views disability as an individual tragedy, and it's based within the body. So the key feature of the medical model can be understood within this quote, where it's really highlighting that it's individually based and there's no mention of society or the environment. So the key features of the medical model include things like individual. An individual here means that it's a problem that's rooted within the individual person. There's an emphasis on tragedy, as disability is something terrible that needs to be fixed. It's really based within the body and mind. It relies on expert knowledge from others, which kind of contradicts what I said earlier around our valuing people with disabilities as experts. It's flipping that to say, no, they're not experts about their own bodies. And then there's this emphasis on eliminating or reducing disability and also identifying the source. So this really goes back to finding out what's wrong with the body and fixing it. And this may feel very familiar if you think about your experience of going to access medical services. And there's absolutely a place within our society for needing to get things fixed, right? Many of us have something wrong with us. We go to the doctor, we talk to them, we identify what's wrong, and we try to get it fixed. But what we're talking about here is a sustained way of being in the world. And within the medical model, it's suggesting that that way of being is wrong and that it needs to be fixed. So that's really at the root of that medical model. If we flip that and look at the social model, then we're kind of placing this emphasis now on the environment. And so what that means is that it's really highlighting this idea that it's the environment that is creating this disabling experience. So disability is more of a social construction. It's not the individual's problem, rather it's the society in which we live that disables people. So the example that I often use is thinking about trying to, if you're a wheelchair user and you want to go to the movies and you show up at the movie theater with your friends and there's a set of stairs to be able to access the theater. Well, if you look at it from the perspective of the medical model, you show up, there's a set of stairs, the person using the wheelchair can't get in because there's something wrong with that individual, because they can't walk up those stairs because they're a wheelchair user. That's the epitome of the medical model. If we flip it to the social model, it's actually suggesting, well, the reason why this person is experiencing disability is because there's a set of stairs. There's a problem with the environment. If we swapped out that set of stairs for a ramp, or if it was just on ground level, all of a sudden now this person is not experiencing disability because they're able to participate in their community in the way that works for them. And so that's really kind of highlighting those two pieces, because it's an important thing to consider when you are connecting with folks experiencing disability, thinking about how you're framing it and how you're approaching conversations with people. So I wanted to kind of highlight these two pieces because if you think about it through this lens of ableism, we're suggesting it's sort of aligned with that medical model perspective where it's really suggesting that there is something wrong with the person and that they are less than, and therefore the problem resides with them. So I want us to sort of flip that a little bit, to start to think more about our environment and how we can change and have control over that piece. So to help us really kind of unpack these ideas around ableism, I thought that we would examine a few examples to see what that might look like. Okay, so the first one I wanted to offer was to share a publication that came out in 2021. So it was the physical activity guidelines that the WHO released. I was going to say recently, but I guess that's a couple of years old now. And it was focused on physical activity guidelines for people living with disability. This was a purposeful step towards ensuring that people experiencing disability are active. So that's great, right? We want people across the country, this global initiative to get folks experiencing disability more active. So what's the problem, right? Well, the problem here is that the evidence base, if you were to go in and read the article and unpack what evidence was used to develop these guidelines, was based almost entirely on studies that did not include people experiencing disability. And we know, as many of us working within the exercise world and the sport world, that there may actually be different physiological responses to exercise. So that might mean that the recommendations may not be suitable for all. For example, here in Canada, as many of you probably know, we do have exercise guidelines that are developed specifically for folks with spinal cord injury or folks with multiple sclerosis. So acknowledging some of those physiological differences that may impact the way people's bodies respond to exercise or exercise settings. So the ableism in this situation is that it's this notion that the same guidelines are going to work for everyone. Now, it may also not be possible for people with disabilities to achieve the physical activity guidelines, but the reason why may not just be due to their bodies, it may also be to other societal barriers that make it harder for them to be active. So for example, a lack of knowledgeable staff in fitness and recreation centers, or inaccessible spaces and equipment, or financial and transportation barriers, or a lack of social support. So it's so much more complicated than just this one piece that suggests that the same guidelines are going to work for everyone. So this is an example of where information comes out, but it's really important to dig a little bit deeper to find out what was going on, who provided this information, so that we can learn a little bit more. And if this is something that you're interested in, there was a great response to this to this article about the physical activity guidelines by Martin Guinness, Latimer Chung, and West. And this was from 2021. And so Martin Guinness and Latimer Chung both are leads within the Canadian Disability Participation Project. And I often share resources from this group. I'm a part of the sport and exercise research team. And there's really, this, probably many of you on the call are part of this group as well. There's been a lot of research that has been done around supporting quality participation and what that looks like, and producing resources that really are trying to examine the experiences of folks with disabilities rather than just assuming that evidence from others will apply. Okay, so that's my first example. My next example may be familiar for some of you. I know not everyone has access to the computer, but if you've heard this phrase before, that sitting is the new smoking, give me a thumbs up. I'd love to know how many of you have heard this phrase, that sitting is the new smoking. I see lots of thumbs up, right? So this has been language that has been used over the last while to try to encourage people to move more in their day. So for many of us who have stationary jobs, I'm sitting at my desk right now, and I've spent a lot of time sitting at my desk. There are a lot of health risks with those sedentary behaviors. Now, why is this ableist that we're saying that sitting is the new smoking? Where's the ableism in that? Well, it's suggesting that being able to stand is the standard, that it is preferred and more desirable than sitting. So this is actually discriminatory towards people experiencing disability, because it's suggesting that those who can stand are superior. And so that's really trying to highlight the messaging here, that sitting bad, standing good, but it's so much more nuanced that. You can absolutely encourage movement. And there's an excellent article written by Smith, Melick, Monforte, and Foster that really looks at the language that's being used here. And they wanted to suggest, okay, well, what else could we do? How else can we encourage people to move? Well, you just kind of change the language a bit. What if the message was just on move more? What if you take out the sit less and then you really just focus on the move more? And suddenly you're being more inclusive with just that subtle language change. So it doesn't have to mean that movement campaigns are bad. It's just thinking about the messaging that we're implying and how we're really suggesting that there's a problem with those who aren't able to stand every 30 minutes or whatever it is. So this is an example of the ableism that exists in our health promotion campaigns. And actually within Participaction, they have done a lot of work to try to shift their language, because they were really using a lot of their messages suggesting that sitting was bad and standing was better. So they've tried to really respond to focus on the move more, move better, rather than the sit less piece. So I found that really interesting. And I'm hoping that by starting to think about some of this language and these ideas, that it makes you a little bit more critical of the campaigns that you see, and starting to really think about, what is this suggesting? And then ultimately, how does that help you in your promotion of activities? If you want everyone to show up, if you're trying to offer inclusive programs or to better serve, athletes with disabilities, what kind of language do you need to use to really show people that their way of moving and being in the world is valued? So one way to do that, as we begin to think about ableism within our practices and within our lives, I think it can be really helpful to pay attention to the stories that we tell. So according to Bacon and Lavani, there is power in the stories we tell. So they say stories, therefore, have the power to be liberating and empowering, but they can also be marginalizing and silencing. So when I say the stories we tell, this means, who are we showcasing in our advertising campaigns? Who are their images up? Who are their images of on the walls in our activity spaces? Who are featured in our promotional materials? Who are we showcasing as volunteers and staff and members? So that's kind of thinking about, who are we including? But then on the flip side, who are we leaving out? And then who is listening? And then what does that look like across all of our practices? So what would happen if we look to disabled writers to learn more about the disability experience? If this is something that you're interested in capturing more or learning more about, there's a really, really excellent collection of essays called Disability Visibility, First-Person Stories from the 20th Century. And it's an excellent book, and it features all of these different essays about a wide variety of topics, and they're all written by people experiencing disability. It's really, really excellent. So I find reading text like that can be a good way to start to really think about things a little differently. Okay, when I talk about this idea around the stories that we tell, one of the things that happens is that we represent disability in different ways. And so what I wanted to do is offer an example. And so to do this, I'm going to show a short video. I think it's just over 2 minutes. As you're watching, I say maybe jot down some notes. I've used this with students before. I just want you to kind of think about your response to the reactions of those in the video. And I'll kind of give you a hint here. So if the purpose of the video is to get you thinking about how people experiencing disability are represented within advertising, because that's kind of the feature here of this short video, what is the key message? So you may kind of get a sense from where I'm going with things. The disability may not be well represented. Okay, so I'm hoping that this video works. I'm going to stop this share. No, that didn't work. There we go. Okay, hopefully this works. So I'm going to hit play, and then if you can just give me a quick thumbs up to let me know that the sound is working okay.
When clothes need to look their whitest, or brightest, and smell their freshest, there's Beam. For more fresh, clean, reach for Beam. There's a whole lot that goes into a box of Crunchios. A whole lot of nutritious whole grain oats. A whole lot of essential vitamins and minerals. And of course, a whole lot of yum. Crunchios, a delicious breakfast the whole family will love.
Okay guys, so what were your first impressions?
I just thought it was a little weird.
That was strange.
It just rubs me the wrong way.
Why is everyone handicapped?
I felt like it was a bit of a stretch. Like, do they do laundry? And
yeah, I don't know if they're trying to use, people with disabilities for like a shock value.
It's just easier to have somebody who's more marketable in front of the camera.
But I think it might in some way honestly retract some people from the product.
For more fresh, clean, reach for Beam.
Does something feel different about this?
That's because you're not used to seeing people with disabilities on screen.
We will later change that.
It made me feel like we still have a long way to go.
Kind of feel disabled people are still a little underrepresented in media and commercials and stuff.
It's actually an association of disabled people saying, I wanna be part of this, like I want to be seen.
It shows you that a disability doesn't have to stop you.
Because the media helps you to accept certain ideas, right?
Yeah.
And the more you're exposed to it, it becomes generally socially acceptable.
Okay, there we go. I'm just going to put a quick, I know Karen had asked for the link. Here, I'll just share the link for everyone in case you want to use that again. And I found it wild that just happened to come from Calgary. There's a really neat website, actually, it's called Ads of the World, and you can check it out. And they have lots of different commercials, ads, video, prints, lots of different things that cover a whole range of topics. And so that was how I came across this video in the first place, as a way to try to examine disability representation and what that means for us. So I always thought this was a pretty neat one to think about how disability is represented within the media. So we know that there's a lack of disability representation in the media. I think that this is something that is changing. I mean, I say this now, but I would definitely suggest that this is changing. I think definitely on the sports side of things, but also within the stories that we tell. For example, I'm not sure if any of you have seen the CBC show. It's called Push. I'm about halfway through, and it's focused on a group of wheelchair users from Edmonton. And it's really just telling their story. And it's trying to, I think, have more representation. So I think that this is something that's changing, but it's important that we're conscious about them, or about how disability is currently represented. And I think that comes through when you hear the comments of people in this video, because it's really showing that they're there really are a lot of ableist notions about how people live and navigate society. So for example, when they first asked people what they thought about the video, and the woman says, well, I don't know if they even do laundry, right? This whole notion that someone who experiences disability wouldn't do their own laundry, full stop, like that nobody would do it, suggests that they are these ideas about how people live their lives and these assumptions about what is and isn't normal. It's pretty fascinating. So I also find it interesting that there's this automatic idea that using people with disabilities is for shock value. And when someone suggested that that could even detract people from purchasing the product. So, I find that really, really fascinating. And so these comments, I think, are really well summarized by Emily Ladau, who is an activist, she's a writer, and she's a public speaker. And she wrote, the lack of disability representation in mainstream media is a constant problem. It's both a cause and effect of societal prejudices surrounding disability. So we know that lack of disability representation is an issue, but I think it's about representing disability from the right perspective, because we want to do more than perpetuate ableist ideals. And so this is really where that whole idea of working with folks experiencing disability is key. And so I think if that is something that you want to change in your current practice, you really want to engage with those who experience disability and figure out the best way to do that. So one approach that you may want to use is by thinking about it from a disability affirming approach. And so this sort of offers a way to counter the ableist narratives that are found in many examples. So this is sort of a way to counter some of the examples that we've talked about so far today. So it really is a non-tragic orientation towards disability in which disability identity is viewed positively. So really, disability culture is valued and worth celebrating. And really, in this case, these stories do not seek to explain the meaning of disability or to inspire or elicit empathy. Rather, it's about showing disabled people simply being in our, and in this case, I'm going to say their, because I don't identify as disabled, words by our own accounts. So the really key features here are that it really is driven by those experiencing disability, but also looking at ways of celebrating and thinking that disability is something that's valued. So I think a lot of times people think, okay, that's great, but where do I begin? What do I actually do? So I think it's really important that you start by learning from those with lived experience. So as I've said a couple of times today, people experiencing disability are the experts. And so this was a quote from my dissertation from years ago, where I did some work learning from folks in the disability community. Specifically, I asked them about the practice of using disability simulations. And so that was a common practice up here at the U of A, where students would use a wheelchair to see what it was like to have a physical impairment, or wear blindfolds to see what it's like to have a visual impairment. And as a teaching assistant at the time, leading those activities, I felt very uncomfortable by suggesting that we might come to know about the disability experience through these brief experiences. So that was the focus of my dissertation work. And one of the studies was looking at the perspective of those from the disability community. And one participant shared, you gotta involve the disability community. She said, this is just harsh and you shouldn't take this personally, but you shouldn't be teaching disability if you don't have the disability community involved. You just shouldn't. It's not right. That's my criticism about simulations. If there's nobody with a disability involved in it, there's no value. You're just wasting an opportunity for such great teaching. It's a wasted opportunity when you don't include the people with disabilities. And so this is from interviews that I did a long time ago. I probably actually did them in 2014. It's coming up on almost 10 years ago. And the words of this participant have always stuck with me. And I continue to use this quote because it really is powerful about how important it is that you do involve folks with lived experience in the work that you do. For any of you that attended our APA symposium back in March, you will hopefully remember, it would have stuck with you, that this was something that we tried to do quite a bit, right? We really wanted to highlight the voices of those with lived experience because they are the experts and they're the ones that we want to learn from. Okay, but sometimes I think people say, great, but I don't know anyone who identifies as disabled. So my first comment would usually be, you probably do, but you just don't know it yet, because there's lots of disabilities that are invisible. So you may not actually know for sure. But rather than being too concerned about that piece, I recommend the following: get involved in the community. You may already have, athletes that you connect with, that you are learning from their lived experience. There's many, many great organizations across our province and beyond who are always looking for volunteers. Maybe it's just attending an event, going to a fun run that supports an organization that it will include folks with disabilities. Thinking about like the Paratough Cup that was hosted down in Calgary a month ago. Those kind of events are a great way to start to get connected and build relationships with the community. I also really encourage you to read stories, books, and articles written by people with lived experience, such as Disability Visibility, the book that I mentioned. Emily Ladow, I should add it up here. She's written an excellent introduction to disability kind of book. And if that's something that you're interested in, I have my email at the end. Please reach out and I'm happy to send you the title. Also listening to podcasts. There's a couple of great ones I follow, Down to the Struts. The Accessible Stall is Emily Ladow's podcast. Or if you want a sports specific one, A Winning Mindset, Lessons from the Paralympics. And then finally, there's some great movies, a couple of documentaries that are available on Netflix, I believe. They used to be for sure. Crip Camp looks at a youth summer camp down in the States, but really uses it as a platform to showcase the disability rights movement. Judith Heumann, who passed away recently, was kind of the key voice behind making changes to that led to the establishing of the ADA down in the States. So that's a really great one to watch. And then Rising Phoenix looks at Paralympic athletes. And so you can learn more about their experiences. And that's another good one as well. So just a few options to help you get started if you're not quite sure what to do. I also wanted to touch briefly on language, because I think language can often be intimidating, and the words that we choose to use matter. So one thing that may be helpful for your organization is to draft a language statement. This is one that we use at the Stedward Center, and we found it helpful just to sort of have a shared understanding of the language that we use. We looked at some of the academic writing as a way to help us to choose words that are most appropriate. This gives us a place to start with our staff so that we're consistent and respectful, but we also appreciate that folks experiencing disability may use different language, and that's okay. We're not going to tell them how to describe their bodies or their experiences. And so it really is kind of this open conversation. And when in doubt, use the person's name. I think that's always like such a good, powerful starting point that we're talking about people. And then finally, thinking about accessibility and inclusion, a few more tips about how do you kind of go forward with this. So can you embrace difference or acknowledge that there may be different ways of doing things and moving? So thinking about that when you're making decisions about practice or deciding on programming or whatever it is that you're going to be doing in your work. Using your voice to advocate for accessible and inclusive spaces. So if you're hosting an event, are you ensuring that that event is in a place that all folks can get to? Are you thinking about the different options in terms of making things available and accessible, reaching out to people to find out what their access needs might be? All of those different pieces are really, really important. And sometimes it just takes somebody asking the question about, is this the best space that we should be in? Okay, where else can we put it? Sometimes people say, well, nobody with a disability ever shows up, so it doesn't matter. I would challenge you to flip that to say, well, if you don't have the accessible space, no one's going to show up. So just thinking about how can you kind of get it started. Learning about the accessibility supports that are available to you. So what do you have available within your workplace, within your community? And then how can you kind of share those and let others know about them? Hosting events and activities in accessible formats and spaces, asking about access needs, and just being open and learn from those who know their bodies best. And then the last one is really important. It's to be specific about what you can and cannot do as a way to make people feel welcome. You know, we all recognize that every event or experience or service is not going to be perfect. So it can be helpful for folks in the disability community to make decisions about what is going to work for them if they know how they're going to be able to participate. So this comes from some of the work that Piers and Conneval have done in the past, examining a wide variety of program websites and looking at what do we know about parasport. Well, we need to know, we need to be able to communicate to families and participants that these are the accessibility features we have, so that there's very clear communication. So that's a really great way to start that conversation too, so people can decide if that's going to work for them. And then also just to keep it open that if you're not sure, feel free to reach out and we can have those conversations. So these are all just some tips about how you might want to get started. Okay, a couple of concluding thoughts. Really prioritize learning from and with people experiencing disability. Build relationships that are reciprocal and that can lead to longer term engagement. I think that's a really great way that it's going to take time so that you can really learn and understand and continue those conversations. Use your voice to advocate for accessibility and inclusion. Sometimes that's the best thing that you can do as somebody who, you know, for example, myself, I don't identify as experiencing disability, but I can certainly raise my hand and ask and advocate for those spaces. And when in doubt, ask questions. Or that you need to know, or that you're the expert, just ask questions. Okay, before I pause to see if you have questions, a couple of things I wanted to share. At the beginning of May, the Stedford Center is hosting a national co-hosting a national coaching for Parasport Summit. There is opportunity to participate on the first day on May 2nd. If you are interested, I will put the link. Sorry, I meant to put the link in the chat box. How do I get there? There we go. There's the link to the website. So if you want information about it, then you can check it out there. The other piece is we also offer an adapted physical activity graduate certificate up here through KSR. So if you have a degree and you want some extra learning, this is a great way to engage more with these ideas and issues and continue the conversation. And then as well, I said, stay in touch. Please connect. There's my email, Twitter handle, and then our Stedford Center website. And I think that's it. And those are references. So please, I'd be happy to answer questions or some more conversation as well. I'm just going to stop sharing.
Hi, Jen. Sorry we missed you at the beginning. Before we jump into questions, I just wanted to say a really big thank you on behalf of CSI Calgary for you joining us today. I've heard you speak before and I'm still taking away new things every time. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks to all of our staff and sport partners who are here today. If anybody does have questions, you can put them in the chat box and I can moderate, or please feel free to just jump on and speak yourself.
And I saw Ashley put in a really great session that's coming up. Dr. Robert Townsend is awesome. He has done some really great writing around disability sport coaching. So I highly recommend attending. That'll be a really good session.
All right, quiet group today. I know asking questions about some of this stuff sometimes can be uncomfortable too. So if anybody has questions about it and you're unsure or uncomfortable to speak out loud, you can always email them to myself or email them to Jen, and we can do that way too. But Ashley, I see your hand up.
Thank you. And thanks so much to CSI Calgary for the invitation today. And Jen, that was incredibly helpful. So thank you. Knowing and understanding and recognizing a few faces that are here today, maybe a little bit of guidance if we find ourselves in uncomfortable situations where maybe we're feeling or seeing some of that ableism is present, and we're not sure, excuse me, how to go about leading a productive conversation around that. So maybe just some guidance on when we see it, how do we, next steps for conversations.
Man, that's a really good question. I think that's a really, really hard thing to do. And I don't know if I definitely don't have the answers around that one. I think one way to approach it more broadly is by continuing to promote people living with disability as the experts. And I think if we continue to create this culture of openness about having conversations, if we continue to, within our staff teams, within people we work with, it creates a space that then if somebody does say something and you think, oh, I'm not sure about that, that you could maybe approach it and say, hey, have you thought about this before? Have you considered looking at it from this view? So rather than, it's going to be a tricky conversation if you call somebody out and say, hey, that was ableist. What you said was wrong. That's not going to create the space where people are going to be willing to talk about it. So maybe it's just approaching it from this view as, hey, have you considered how somebody might interpret that or other ways of looking at it so that you really are more open? Because I think the worst thing that you can do is just shut it down. So people feel like shame and offended because maybe they lacked knowledge. So I would encourage you just to try to be open with conversations as much as possible. I don't know if that really answered your question because it's a really, really hard one. I think even on our team, we've had lots of situations where we hear something and we say, okay, do we say something about that? What do we do with that? So it's a tough one. And I think having colleagues, like having great support networks that you can follow up with and say, hey, I came across this situation today. I don't know what to do about it. Even that can help to brainstorm and to troubleshoot with other people within your community.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. That is super helpful.
And we have one comment in the box from Jaylina, who's one of our physiologists. She said, disability is a social construct. Love how that was framed. And I would agree with that one. I had never seen the actual medical model definition for it, and that was quite shocking. And one thing I'll note, just as a thought for our staff, like we play in that medical space a lot. And I'm curious how often now, like looking back on my own experiences, I've accidentally fallen into that. If people are open to it, and if you experience those instances, please let me know, or anybody from the Paris Strat group. Hopefully now, if we have a little more awareness, we can start identifying more things we can improve on. So don't hesitate to reach out to any of our group. And then we have one more question in there from Alberta Sports and Recreation. They said, as our organization, we have struggled with deciding how to include the concept of vulnerability for the population we serve, primarily people with visual impairment, while still using a social model of disability. Do you have any suggestions about how to use language for that topic?
And so are you thinking about it in terms of like wanting people to, do you mean about deciding whether or not people with visual impairments are vulnerable? Is that sort of what you're getting at?
Yeah, for us, a lot of like our grant like requests are about meeting the needs of vulnerable people, and some of the members of our board and some of the other people we work with who have visual impairment sort of maybe don't necessarily agree that they're especially vulnerable, which is totally understandable. And so I guess as an organization, that's something that we've been trying to balance and how to use that language, I guess.
That's a great question. And I think that it becomes more complicated when there's funding tied to it, right? Because as an organization, you need funding to be able to sustain your programs and services. I think that comes up a lot too when we're doing things around, like fundraising campaigns. A few years ago, we had a bunch of conversations here at the Sedgwick Center around how are we going to ask donors to contribute for a gala that we were having. And there's this automatic tendency to pitch people with disabilities as being pitied. And you want to make people cry a bit, so they open up their wallets, and that's really that kind of charity narrative. And I think what we need to continue to do is to push away from that and really focus on the positive impact that dollars are having on people's lives. And I think it's great, ASRAB, you guys do great work and you are supporting people with visual impairment in the community. So it's important to celebrate that. And I think if that creates some tension, then that creates space for conversation to say, these people are vulnerable because our communities are not set up in a way that is creating safe spaces for them. So that's why they're vulnerable, because they are vulnerable going out into the community without the right supports in place. And so it's sort of our job to fix that and to make it better so that people with visual impairments can live very independent lives. But it's important that it's a community effort, that we have all of these supports in place so that they can travel on transit safely and they can arrive at their destination and count on what experience they're going to have when they get there. So I think it's a really tricky one, but I encourage you to like stay true to what you believe is best for, you know, to talk to your athletes and your participants, ask them how they want to be talked about. Maybe that's a starting point too.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
All right. Any last words? Okay, then thank you again, everybody, for joining over your lunch hour. Thank you so much, Jen, for being here. Sorry we couldn't get in person, but this is better than nothing. Jen, if you don't mind hanging on for a minute, I have one more thing for you. Otherwise, have a great day, everyone, and thank you again for joining.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate you spending your lunch hour with us. That was really, really great.
Yeah. Thanks,
I should
Jen.
stop recording. Hang on.
Oh, sure, yeah. This is